Hello to you all, dear and lovely people of this beautiful planet. Welcome to the 10th episode of the Elixir of Awareness channel. In this episode, we're going to tell the life story of a man named David Starr Jordan. The main source of this episode is a book called Why Fish Don't Exist, written by Mrs. Lulu Miller. David Jordan was born in 1851 in upstate New York in an apple orchard and almost on the darkest night of the year. And maybe that was the reason why he always looked at the sky and stars during his childhood. In his opinion, the night sky was disordered and unknown, and that is why he wanted to discover its secrets. According to him, it took him 5 years to arrange almost the entire night sky. In fact, it took him 5 years to learn the names of all the stars and choose new names for those that didn't have names. And in all those years, he tried to organize this irregular world of stars in his mind and master all of them. And he added the word star to his middle name in his honor, and he was proud for the rest of his life because his name was David Starr Jordan. After mastering the heavenly ones, David went to the earthly ones. He fell in love with the diverse collection of plants that existed in the surrounding nature, and he named them one by one. He still searched and tried to discover their characteristics, and in this way, he tried to order the irregular world around him. David was discovering the world around him until his brother got typhus disease. He saw his brother suffering for days and days. He waited for hours by his bed and wished that his brother would get back to full health once again. But this didn't happen, and a few days later his brother Rufus died. After the death of his brother, David's desire to organize and explore the surrounding world increased greatly. He quickly was flipping and studying the biology books, and he was searching around him for different species that he saw in the books. He'd take a sample of them, dry them, and was writing their name. And obsessively and excessively, he was trying to know the unknown and mysterious phenomena in the surrounding world and conquer them. Things could have continued like this for the hero of our story, and he'd continue to desperately search and discover all kinds of plants, and others wouldn't understand the value of his work. But in early spring, on a dark morning, David was flipping through his newspaper and suddenly he saw an announcement. A natural history training course was held by the sea, and the teacher was none other than one of the greatest biologists of that period named Louis Agassiz. David couldn't believe it, and he registered for that course at the first opportunity, and a few months later, he saw the ocean for the first time at the age of 22. If love at first sight exists, it's something like this moment. The moment when David saw the ocean for the first time, and this love of discovering the unknowns never left him. As we said, in his early childhood, David tried to search in the sky and find answers to his questions there, and then he started searching for different types of plants on the earth. But now he was facing a mysterious and vast world called the ocean, a world that was eagerly waiting for David to discover it so that it might give him the answers to the questions of his searching mind. Eyes are strange organs because they show different things to different people. An ocean that was just billions of liters of salt water from the eyes of other people, but for David it appeared like a lover. And the sound of the ocean waves for David was like a loud call that pulls him towards it. Mr. David Starr Jordan's dream was to discover and dominate the whole world. He took his first big step by discovering fishes. It isn't enough to hear about this part of the story, you've to see it. So if you don't need your eyes, please close your eyes for a few minutes. Imagine the hero of our story, David, on the ship deck. Sailors sing a special maritime hymn. The wind hits David's face and hair. Imagine David Starr Jordan looking at the horizon. Imagine his looking at the ocean. Like someone who goes to the unknown's war of the world. 10 or 12 other men have joined him in this great adventure. Imagine the sound of a few determined men singing and the wind blowing in the sails. His ship splits the chest of waves with strength, and the sound of huge waves is heard. And this is the beginning of the battle of an adventurous and brave man with a big world full of unknown secrets. The story of our hero continues until one day David's laboratory catches fire due to a lightning strike. Some pages caught fire, and then some other books. Then the walls and then the flames reached the shelves where David's precious and favorite glass boxes were located. In this part of the story, the glass boxes exploded one after the other like a bomb. Most of the fishes evaporated, the unknown known creatures became ashes, and perhaps no one could ever rediscover them. Two years after his marriage, his wife developed severe coughs, developed a severe fever, and died in front of David's eyes. Up to this point in David's life story, the question arises for us about what kind of motivation he's to withstand all this suffering. How David was able to continue living after the death of his brother, and after the laboratory fire, and the destruction of all his efforts, and after the death of his wife. There's a phrase in his memoirs that clarifies the answer for us to a great extent: shield of optimism. His colleagues said that no matter how hard and bad the situation was for David, we could always see him humming a song in the corridor. As if this shield of optimism somehow was creating a distance between him and the sufferings. Finally, the strong will of the hero of our story helped him. And after a while, the name of David Starr Jordan spread all over America. And of course, his name reached the ears of a rich couple, the Stanford family. Yes, the same founders of Stanford University. They traveled thousands of kilometers to meet David and didn't hesitate when they saw the determination and drive in David's eyes. And they offered him the presidency of Stanford University. David immediately accepted their offer. Now that he'd no financial constraints at Stanford, David was directing discovery projects that he'd only dreamed of as a teenager. Now the whole world was under the control of our hero. In those good days, the only stain in David's life was a woman who was one of the founders of Stanford University, Jane Stanford. A year after David's presidency in the university, this woman's wife passed away and the administration of all affairs was entrusted to Jane. Jane did worry about the fishes project and the costs that were allocated to it and tried to reduce the budget and limit David's authority in the university presidency. And in general, there was a hard fight between Jane and David at the university. Suddenly, at the height of this controversy, an unfortunate incident happened. In early 1905, Jane died suddenly while on a trip to Hawaii. It seemed that with this incident, the situation improved a little for David, but wait, the story continues. At 12:05 on the morning of April 18, 1906, in less than a minute, the mountains were split as far as no one knew how many kilometers. And then they stuck together again without anyone noticing. These are the words of David Starr Jordan trying to describe one of the most terrifying moments of his life. San Francisco earthquake of 1906. The magnitude of the earthquake was estimated at 7.9 on the Richter scale. In just 47 seconds, many parts of the city were turned into rubble. Imagine David looking at this terrible sight. The fishes were scattered everywhere, and maybe this was not enough. Before this happened, David in front of the laboratory had made a statue of his teacher who introduced him to the ocean. When David went out of the building, he saw a very bitter and strange scene. The earthquake had thrown the statue of Louis Agassiz on the ground with its head. It was a strange sight. The feet of the statue were facing the sky, and its head was sunk in the ground. Maybe if you were the director of David's life, you'd say to yourself that this picture is too exaggerated. But this happened in reality, and we can't change anything. The world had delivered its message to David so clearly and cruelly. But what do you think our hero did? David looked at the upside-down statue of his teacher for a few minutes and returned to the laboratory. He found a thread and a needle and recognized a familiar fish. And he sewed the plaque of that fish to his flesh. This time he attached it to his flesh, not to the glass box, so that if the aftershock happens again, the names of the fishes will remain on the fishes. Then David called everyone on his team, all those who'd been with David on the trips and who probably still remembered the names of the fish next to the broken glass on the floor, and asked them for help. They needed ethanol so that the fishes wouldn't be spoiled. But the ethanol arrived late, and David and his team poured water on the fishes with a hose for 2 whole days so that the remains of the fishes wouldn't rot. And with all these difficult conditions, they started again to label and naming the few fishes that they could remember. The city was destroyed, and while everywhere was full of dust and the sound of the wind could be heard in the silence of the ruins of the buildings, a man with a thick shield of optimism was looking at the upside-down statue of his master from behind the window and was standing in front of all the chaos of the world with a water hose in his hand. Mr. David Starr Jordan was different from most people in the world. And his difference was that he could fight against any difficult situation with his shield of optimism. He's a book called The Philosophy of Despair. And in this book he stands in front of the hopeless people in the world and those who've wounded and broken hearts. If we're going through a difficult time and we're sad, what's David's advice for us? It's interesting to know that, contrary to your expectation, he's no sympathy with these emotional states. The final conclusion of the Philosophy of Despair book is that despair is our human choice and weakness. And if some people are disappointed in life, it is because they are probably low and small creatures. According to David Despair, it's justified as a teenager, but as an adult, it's a completely wrong and disgusting thing that we should avoid. The first character of our story mocks people who are disappointed in life in many paragraphs in his book. And he sees them as excuse-making people who try to express their despair only to attract more attention. He even accuses disappointed people of being harmful to humanity and having a polluted existence. David goes too far in criticizing these people to such an extent that he says that even the breath of these people is poisonous and stinks of death. But we passed very quickly one of the main characters of this story, which is also one of the big knots of this story: Mrs. Jane Stanford. So let's go back a little further back, 1905, a year before the San Francisco earthquake, when Mrs. Jane was still alive and at the height of her disagreement with David. According to reports, on January 14, 1905, Mrs. Jane Stanford was preparing to sleep at her home. Mrs. Jane drank a glass of water before going to bed as usual. But the taste of water was so bad and terrible that she stuck her finger in her throat to vomit. She quickly informed the others. They also drank some water after calming down Jane, and they also noticed a bad, bitter, and strange taste of the water. In the laboratory, they examined the glass of water and found that the water contained a large amount of a deadly substance called strychnine. Jane survived, but it was clear that she was very scared. And the police detectives also didn't find any clue. Jane went to Hawaii to change her mental condition and be away from danger for a few days. Around 11:15, her companions woke up due to the sound of moaning coming from her room. Jane was screaming with all her heart. They rushed to her room and opened the door and saw Jane lying on the floor and writhing because of pain. The doctor was immediately called. Jane's body was almost paralyzed, and at around 11:30, just a quarter later, she died painfully. After some time, the police and experts arrived at the scene and tasted a little of the liquid that was next to her bed and noticed its bitter and bad taste. Again, traces of that deadly poison were found: strychnine. The police reported that Jane Stanford was killed by the lethal substance strychnine, which was poured into her water bottle by an unknown person or group with criminal intent. The police report reached Stanford University. The corridors and classrooms of the university were filled with panic and sadness. But Mr. David Starr Jordan could still keep calm with his shield of optimism. He traveled thousands of kilometers to Hawaii to prove that Jane Stanford's death was completely accidental. Records show that David hired a doctor in Hawaii and paid $350, which was a substantial amount at the time, to re-examine the case. After David's trip, the cause of death was changed. But what do you think was the cause of death announced? The reason for the death of the founder of Stanford University was announced because of excessive consumption of gingerbread. David Starr Jordan triumphantly returned to his city, and now there was only one thing to do. He should have worn a nice and stylish suit and gone to Jane Stanford's funeral. And he should have given a speech in praise of Jane's efforts for the scientific community. David Starr Jordan has a book called A Guide to the Study of Fishes. If you flip through this book, you'll see pictures of fishes' skeletons, jaw bones, fins, gills, and some things like it. And then on page 430 below a section titled How to Get Fishes, he tells a secret to the readers who've read up to that page of his book. That secret is his favorite trick to catch smart and fast fishes. The same way that is used to catch the fish that escape to the deep sea. But guess what that trick is? Poison. But which poison do you think he recommends? A strong and very dangerous matter. A matter that David himself once said, it's the most bitter thing in the world. Strike 9. After the death of Jane Stanford, the decline of David Starr Jordan's power began gradually in the university. A few years later, in 1913, the Board of Trustees asked him to resign altogether. Of course, because of his many scientific services, they allowed him to keep the position of honorary president of the university. But they took away the executive power from him. David, who was very rich, now had many hobbies and free time. He found new hobbies for himself and began his travels to discover other species of fishes. He went to the Alpine region and saw a village there. A village called Aosta. But something is shocking in the story of this village. This village isn't an ordinary village, it's actually a place for people with disabilities. Whether physical or mental disabilities, for centuries in the Catholic Church, some good-hearted priests took care of those who were rejected from their families because of their condition and gave them food and a place to live. Imagine a village where people with physical and mental suffering have been living for centuries. Many of these people later became very skilled workers in cooking, agriculture, and industry. Many of them fell in love, got married, and even had children. It can be said that it's an upside-down village, because in that village abnormality was considered normal. It's a village where the deprived people in the society enjoyed the support that gave them the power to flourish. Most people are very excited and enjoy when they hear the story of this village. And they say what a beautiful and humane way to help the deprived people of society. But David Starr Jordan, the main character of our story, described it as a place of terror in every sense, which in his opinion was made up of creatures with low intelligence. David believed that helping these people with disabilities is a kind of fight against the law of evolution and hinders human progress. David wrote a book in which he believed that the illiterate, the poor, the criminals, and, in his view, the sex perverts must be completely destroyed so that the human race can grow, or that permission to reproduce should be taken away from them forever. In his speeches, he told people that things like poverty and corruption can be inherited. And as a result, we've to eliminate them as we drain the swamps. In all his writings and speeches, David put the poor and the physically and mentally disabled in the same category and believed that they should be eliminated. He considered them bad genes. The bad genes who, in his opinion, didn't have the right to live. In 1907, he began advocating a law for racial sterilization. Some of his friends succeeded in passing a law in the state of Indiana, which was considered the first example not only in America but in the whole world. And 2 years later, David fought with the same determination and tireless spirit to get this law approved in California. He showed so much commitment to the idea that he was asked to chair the Eugenics Committee of the American Breeders' Foundation, and he accepted with pleasure. This was an honor for him along with his other honors. David began teaching courses on eugenics at universities across America. From Stanford to Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, and Princeton, across America, a race began to find the families with good genes and also the wrong genes. Babies were compared to each other, and they were measured and weighed. And the whitest skin, the roundest head, the most symmetrical face, and the biggest eyes were labeled as good genes. And of course, these comparisons also had losers, those whose right to live and reproduce was taken away from them forever. In 1916, one of David's colleagues wrote a book influenced by his ideas, a book that a German man named Adolf Hitler called his holy book. 10 years later, Hitler approved the first mandatory sterilization law in Germany under the influence of reading this book. David Starr Jordan was a very strong-willed person, so he didn't hesitate even for a moment to expand his ideas and the things he believed in. Only in America, hundreds of thousands of people were sterilized under the influence of his idea. Hundreds of thousands of people faced the new reality due to reasons such as disability, poverty, or the delinquency of their parents. That no other child will come to this world with their distinctive eyes or their special features. David believed with absolute certainty that poverty, suffering, and criminality are genetic factors and can be cut from society with a knife. And he never thought for a moment about the role of the surrounding circumstances in their fate and lack of growth. David Starr Jordan remained a big fan of eugenics until the end of his life. No matter what we search in the documents, we don't find any sign of his regret and reconsideration in the last moments of his life. He didn't hesitate even for a moment about his ideas. But why? He had this terrible power to convince himself that what he says and thinks is absolutely true. Maybe to understand where David's personality changed, we've to go back to the moment of losing his brother. After his brother's death, he thought about how he could insure himself against the great uncertainty of the world. At some point in our lives, we all hear the call that you aren't important. And some of us, like David, decide to prove how important we and our opinions and ideas are. And even we're very determined to convey to others what we think is absolutely correct. You know, there's a time in life when we realize that we're on just a particle of a smaller particle. It's as if a whisper is heard in our mind saying, "Then what's the point of our life? What's the meaning of life when we're so small and the world is so big and powerful? Then why should we live?" We want to say that the understanding of this sentence, "You are not important," can have different effects on different people. For example, a person may feel the phrase "you aren't important" so deeply and fearfully that they takes refuge in fanatical groups. Actually, the person decides to surrender all their reason to that ideology in order not to face the feeling of their insignificance. With this method, these people escape from their feeling of insignificance and treat their deep wounds in this way. And this feeling of absolute certainty provided David with an antidote and a warm and loving sense of being important. Let's think for a moment about the things that we don't doubt. Just put a question mark in front of them for a few seconds and a few short moments. How can we be sure that we're completely right? How can we be sure that our judgment about a phenomenon is completely correct? But this isn't the end of the story. The world had another surprise for David. The world wanted to challenge his most important certainty. After much research, scientists concluded that there's no scientific classification for the fish group. There are amphibians, birds, reptiles, and also mammals, all of which have a common ancestor. But in this new scientific classification, fishes are known as a non-inclusive group, which isn't considered a complete group in the evolutionary group in the biology system. Maybe this is the bitter irony of this story. Because David Starr Jordan was wrong even about something he was absolutely certain he'd never be wrong about that. Now, this sentence that fishes are not exist can be a big shock for all of us. In all the times when we consider ourselves too rightful and don't doubt ourselves and our ideas and thoughts, we should remember that our mental categories may change under the influence of time, place, geography, and environmental conditions. But what are the roots of this false assessment? There are several traps by which our mind becomes captive and can't search and discover new truths. One of these cases is the trap of simple stories. We really like to simplify the world. Our desire to make simple stories blinds us to see the real stories. David Starr Jordan gave a very simple answer to a very complicated question. Because removing the poor, the disabled, and the weak was somehow erasing the question, not the solution. We give them also simple and exaggerated roles in these simple stories. Our mentality is such that one is absolute good and one is absolute evil. We want to say that many times in our relationships in life. The problem is that we always repeat a simple story about a person, a situation, or an event with ourselves. While these simple black and white characters have captured us in the trap of our judgment, the practical solution to this is to always remind ourselves to always try to imagine two different stories and two different scenarios in all situations. In fact, we must try to always look at that person, event, or situation from another angle. It's very effective if we force ourselves to always look at everything from two sides and two different angles. The second mental problem that causes us to be caught in the trap of bigotry is the feeling of being rightful. Now that after much research, human has started to know themselves, they've realized a bitter and interesting truth. The truth is that our beliefs are more of a feeling than a logical decision based on reasoning. With this look, everything changes. The thing is that we've a default about ourselves. We've a personality that is smeared with memories, different experiences, the conditions in which we live, and the all things that are considered valuable in our society. And this issue creates a presupposition in us that we judge people, life, events, phenomena, and the whole world with this presupposition. We forget in different situations that the things that we may feel we know completely were made more by our emotions than by real evidence. The feeling of being rightful blinds us to the massive evidence that proves us wrong. The feeling of being rightful also destroys our best human qualities like curiosity and learning. It captures our mind and our mind can't move. We've to ask ourselves an important question. We should take a little distance from this busy life and ask ourselves, what things do I believe? And what if the things I believe in are wrong? David Starr Jordan never once asked himself this question, and we think most of us don't ask ourselves. Many of us have never said to ourselves this sentence, maybe I'm wrong. Believe us, this step is very important if we can write a list of things we believe in and then put a question mark in front of each one. This question mark isn't going to take away our beliefs from us. Rather, this question mark is supposed to stop the possible dangerous effects of our beliefs. This question mark is supposed to be the beginning of our amazing journey into new unknowns. Yes, if we don't ask ourselves these questions, we may forever be trapped in the prison of our mental beliefs and never discover the world around us. But what's the solution? One of the solutions is listening, but listening to learn. Usually, most of our conversations with others are influenced by two destructive habits. One is that we usually listen to the words of the opposite person just to win. It means when the other person is explaining and trying to show us another angle of the story, at that moment we constantly think about what our answer will be. So we aren't listening to that person. As a result, we don't pay attention to the depth of the conversation. And the second destructive habit is listening for advice. And both of these habits have a common point with each other. In both situations, we're the ones who think completely right, and to the extent that we think we don't need new information, and we even try to advise others to look at the world like us and think like us. Do you see how we got caught in the trap of what we are? And this issue itself doesn't allow us to reach the better person we can become. Many people don't leave their limited mental lands for years. The final question of this episode is, do you usually try to look at a subject from different angles? What did you learn from David's story? Please share your comments with us. At the end of this episode, let's make a promise to each other. The next time we felt we are absolutely rightful, just remind ourselves that the fishes don't exist.